Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about how to use and abuse the Eldar Night Spinner in 10th edition. So the Night Spinner is something that I've talked about on this channel a couple times here and there, but I really have never taken a deep dive, and I really want to do that today because the Night Spinner is possibly now one of the most crucial part of competitive list building after the September balanced data slate. So before the balanced data slate, a lot of people looked at the Night Spinner and they said, well, it's really good, but do I really need one in my list? It was in some competitive lists, but a lot of players just didn't have it because they were beating their opponents in a couple turns with the Wraith Knight and, all the devastating wounds that we had. It wasn't really hard to just kill your opponent, and when you can just kill your opponent that easily, you don't really need board control. Because, when your opponent doesn't have any units left on the board, it's not really necessary. But now that that's been toned down and, we do need a lot more board control to make an impact in competitive play and even just, semi-competitive play, you're trying to win with your buddies at your local gaming group or whatever it is, you're going to find that including a Night Spinner in your list is almost a must-have. But using a Night Spinner is not easy. You can't just put it on the board and expect it to do well without really knowing how it works and knowing what to shoot at. So without further ado, let us go ahead and dive right into the video and talk about how to make the Night Spinner busted in 10th edition. But first, a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at in today's video. We're going to be looking at its stats, weapons, and special rules, strengths and weaknesses, combos and synergies, the best units to target with a Night Spinner, a turn-by-turn target priority to maximize board control, and lastly, what the Night Spinner's role in an Eldar army is and how to make the most out of it. Looking at its stats, it looks pretty basic for an Eldar grav tank. It moves 14 inches, making it very fast, able to reposition quickly. It has a 3+ save with 12 wounds and toughness 9, so it's pretty squishy for a large vehicle. Anything like a last cannon, a couple last cannons get through this thing and they'll make pretty short work of it. So you do have to be careful with this thing when using it. As for its ranged weapons, it's armed with the mighty Doomweaver that pumps out 2d6, strength 7, AP 0, damage 2 shots with devastating wounds and blast. On top of this, it also has twin linked, so it can reroll the wounds, which is very powerful considering, it's kind of a low strength weapon for heavy infantry, yet it wants to be targeting heavy infantry, and having AP 0 is also not great. So being able to proc those devastating wounds more frequently with twin linked is good. But its damage isn't really why you take it. It can also take a shuriken cannon or twin linked shuriken catapult. And I'm a little bit mixed on this myself. I prefer the shuriken cannon just for that little bit of extra firepower in the late game. It's good for, taking out 1 or 2 Marines left on an objective, stuff like that. But there's a good argument for twin linked shuriken catapults. Being able to advance and still score on secondaries in the late game is a good option as well, especially on a model that is probably not going to be using its shuriken cannon every single turn. As for its melee weapons, it has the Wraithbone Hold. Just like all Eldar vehicles, it's, pretty basic, strength 6, and that means that it can tank shock decently well in a pinch. You get those 6 dice to roll, 4+ mortal wounds with tank shock, so not bad. Again, in the late game when you're trying to steal some objective from an opponent, or you just need something dead really badly. As for its abilities, enemy units hit with the Doomweaver in your shooting phase debuff the enemy unit with -2 movement and prevent advances. So this is what makes the Night Spinner such a terror in competitive play and in general, right? This is a very frustrating ability if you know how to use it correctly. Preventing advances can cut the movement value pretty much in half of any unit that is slow. So any unit relying on that D6 extra movement to get up the board is now going to be at a severe disadvantage. On top of that, the -2 movement really does make this thing worth its weight in gold. A lot of good players will already have the board mapped out in their heads before the game starts. They'll know exactly how far their units can move to where and what they can get away with before the game starts. So they'll know where to put their units and how far they're going to move to get onto objectives and things like this. And what the Night Spinner does is that the Night Spinner says, well, fuck your plans. I'm going to prevent you from moving an extra 2 inches and advancing as well. So go fuck yourself. Basically, that's what the Night Spinner does. And any ability that basically tells you to go fuck yourself is an ability that I'm a fan of. So yes, it's a really strong ability, and if used well, it is game winning. Of course, on the other hand, if you don't know how to really use it, then it sucks, right? If you use it on shooting units or units that aren't really going to move a whole lot, it's a wasted ability. So you do have to be careful with it. Just like all vehicles, the Night Spinner also does, less damage when it's low on wounds. It has -1 to hit. However, with the Night Spinner in particular, I don't really think it's that big of a deal, especially when you're firing indirect. Now, the reason is because when you're firing indirect, you already have a -1 to hit, and you can't stack negative modifiers. So it really doesn't do that much, actually. It only does something when you're firing at something you can see. The Night Spinner, of course, can also replace its Shuriken Catapult with the Shuriken Cannon. Again, the choice is up to you. I prefer the Shuriken Cannon, but that's just me. The Shuriken Catapult is also a good option for this model. As far as its point cost, it costs 180 points, which is pretty reasonable in my opinion, considering how much utility it provides. So here's the other thing, right? This thing is expensive. It's 180 points and it doesn't do a lot of damage. A lot of people, especially newer players, are going to look at this and say, well, this thing sucks, right? It doesn't do any big damage. I want to do big dick damage. But unfortunately, that's not really what the game is about. It is obviously a part of the game. You want units that can do a lot of damage, but not everything in your army is supposed to do a lot of damage. And the Night Spinner is a utility unit, right? It's meant to control the board and not necessarily deal a lot of damage. So it may actually not earn its points back in units killed. In fact, after the nerfs to its points, I've had a lot of games where it doesn't really earn its points back that well, right? It shoots at some Marines, probably in a course of a 5-turn game, will kill about 5 or 6, maybe. And this is because sometimes you won't always be shooting at infantry. Sometimes you'll be shooting at vehicles, and the damage is very low, right? Especially against vehicles, you really rely on those devastating wound procs. And sometimes I've had games where I roll really low on the 2d6 attacks. I'll roll like a 2 or something like that, or a 3, and even though I'll hit the target, I won't wound it. So there will be games where it just won't do that much damage, but that's really not where its value is. So basically what I'm saying is don't let the high points cost of this model prevent you from taking it, because its ability to control the board is way more important. It also has fly, so just like all Eldar skimmers, it can fly over terrain and other models if needed. It's useful, but again, with the Night Spinner, you're mostly just going to have it parked in the back somewhere where no one can see it, so it's not really that big of a deal. Okay, so as for the Night Spinner's strengths and weaknesses, its strengths are that it can shoot at enemy units out of line of sight due to indirect fire, which make this thing brilliant. I think if it didn't have indirect fire, it would be a really hard unit to use and possibly not even worth it, just because you couldn't guarantee that it survived longer than a couple turns. But because it has that, it's very survivable and can apply its effect every single turn in a game. Its ability prevents advancing and slows movement, which is massive. It's also a fast platform capable of repositioning quickly, which is, nothing to scoff at. Some enemy armies are very quick and can close very quickly on you in a couple of turns, regardless of your ability to prevent them from moving and advancing. So also being able to get out of trouble quickly is a good thing. Its weaknesses, however, are that obviously it has low damage and it relies on devastating wound proc. So again, you really don't want to rely on this thing for damage. It is mostly a utility piece. As for its combos and synergies, Guide really helps it hit more reliably. It typically hits units on a 4+. With Guide, you're making sure that at least one hit is going to go through. And it may not be necessary. A lot of you guys out there will say, well, on average, you should get at least one hit, right? But I'm telling you guys from experience, there are games, at least once per game, where you're going to roll that dreaded double 1 or 3 or 4 or whatever, right? And if you're hitting an enemy unit on a 4+, you could whiff that. You could miss all 4 of those attacks. You could miss all 3 of those attacks without the proper rerolls. Yes, you do get unparalleled foresight, but still, that's only one reroll. Rerolling all of them is much more reliable. So if you do have Guide in your army and you really need something slowed down, you might want to consider, instead of putting it on a high damage unit, putting it on this just to make sure that that unit can't get onto an objective or get around the corner to threaten your more vulnerable units. And that's kind of it. The Night Spinner doesn't really care about any of the other synergies that we have in our army. The lethal hits don't really matter, the ignores cover doesn't matter, and the +1 to wound doesn't matter. So Shroud Runners, Vipers, Eldrad, all of their buffs are essentially not worth the Night Spinner's time. Alright, so we've been talking about the Night Spinner for a little bit now, but what are the best units to target with a Night Spinner? Because it's a little bit weird, because newer players might look at its damage profile and say, well, this is a light infantry killer, or this is good at killing 2 wound models. But really, those typically aren't the best targets. The best targets are the targets that are going to be affected most by its ability. And those units, first and foremost, are slow-moving units like Terminators. Now, unless the Terminator unit is deep striking, and again, most opponents will not do this because they want to get their Terminator unit onto that objective turn 1 so that they can hold out for the rest of the game and score on their primaries, right? So using a Night Spinner on a unit like this is a fantastic way to prevent them from getting on those objectives. So those Terminator units will only typically be able to move 3 inches and cannot advance, which means they're not going to be able to get on that objective turn 1, which means they won't be scoring primary points on that objective. Or they'll have to use another unit to do it, a more fragile unit that is perhaps faster, and you can use that opportunity to pick that unit off at your leisure. So instead of having to shoot at a 10-man Terminator blob with Apothecary and all the support buffs and all the damage reductions and command points that can just stop your shooting and make your weapons feel useless, you can instead shoot something off an objective that is actually killable. And that Terminator unit of your opponent's is really not doing anything for its points. Any units that also rely on advance rolls to get into position or can charge after advancing are great targets as well. And guess what? The new Space Marine Codex just came out with a new Stormlands Task Force detachment. And guess what that detachment does? It allows all units in the opposing army to advance and charge. And quite simply, the Night Spinner prevents this because it prevents advancing. So you don't have to worry about that, stratagem that gives you an auto advance of 9 inches, and then you can charge after, With the Night Spinner, you can put that fear to bed. Although you do have to just still watch out for fast-moving units because they just have a high movement value in general, and charging is 2d6. So that's still a threat range you have to worry about. You just don't have to worry about those extra long charges. Any unit that also needs its full movement to get onto an objective or in threat range of something is a unit that you should be targeting with the Night Spinner. So let me give you a quick example. Let's say your opponent has a unit that you can't see or shoot at, but also has the movement to get behind obscuring terrain or around obscuring terrain at a certain angle to be able to shoot at your more vulnerable units behind it. So maybe you have a unit of Shadow Specters behind some obscuring terrain in more of the center of the battlefield. And your opponent maybe has a unit of bikes or, something else that can get around that piece of cover and shoot you. Your Shadow Specters are most likely going to be dead, right? But if you can use a Night Spinner to prevent their movement, right? Prevent that little bit of extra movement, that 2 inches, and also prevent an advance roll, that could mean that your opponent's not going to be able to get all the models around that piece of terrain. And as such, either your opponent is going to have to go elsewhere and change their plans, or they're going to have to just shoot you with a couple models. So I've actually had this happen to me before where I noticed one of my opponent's Outrider units was on a flank. It had the movement, barely, to get around a piece of obscuring terrain and shoot at a unit of Spectres that I had hiding there. Well, I decided to shoot them with the Night Spinner. And not only did this prevent them from advancing, but it also made sure that only one of the 3 models in the unit could actually see my Shadow Specters to shoot them. And on top of that, it put them out of charge range, so my Shadow Specters didn't have to worry about getting a pretty brutal charge from an Outrider unit. Okay, so this might leave some of you wondering, though, what units should I target at what times in the game? Because obviously there's going to be a lot of different choices on the battlefield, and sometimes there's going to be 2 good choices. What do? Do I prevent an enemy unit from getting onto an objective, or do I save one of my other units that is vulnerable to attack? And while there are many factors that will determine which units you will prioritize over others, there are some general rules to keep in mind from turn to turn. So what I want to do next is kind of show you a turn-by-turn general target priority to maximize the amount of board control you're exerting over your opponent. So turn 1, when you get your turn, you should target units that can successfully get onto objectives in the midboard. So this is basically to prevent your opponent in turn 2 scoring primary objectives. Oftentimes, we're not going to have the firepower or the line of sight available to us to completely annihilate a really tough target in the middle of the board. And a lot of the times, it's just going to be straight up impossible. So take Necrons, for example, with the Lich Guard Blob, or Chaos Space Marines with the Abaddon Terminator Death Star. Both of those units are going to be pretty much impossible for us to remove during the first few turns of the game, especially after the Wraith Knight changes and things like that. So instead of trying to remove them, what you're going to do is instead slow them down, prevent them from advancing, prevent them from getting onto objectives, so that you can basically prevent them from scoring points. On turn 2, you want to target fast units that can wheel around the flanks and hit your vulnerable units or engage you in combat. So pretty much at turn 2, your opponent is going to be able to get onto objectives, whether they're debuffed with the -2 and can advance or not. That Abaddon Blob is probably going to use Dark Obscuration to prevent you from shooting it, and of course the Lich Guard are probably already going to be on the objective or close to. So, the next best thing is to target those fast units that can hit you on the flanks. If an Eldar player can control the flanks of the board, they will have a much better chance of winning the game. Opponents who are combat-oriented will also be looking to engage you in close combat on turn 2, so try to locate the units that are most likely to reach your lines and target them with the Night Spinner so that basically they have a harder time getting into combat and engaging you. Eldar are not typically known for good close combat in general, so you do want to watch out for this as it can be a weak spot in your army. On turn 3, you generally want to target units that want to reestablish primary objective control. So other than that big Death Star, which at this point you're probably going to ignore, there's going to be other units on your opponent's board edge that might be trying to reestablish some objective control in the middle, or trying to reestablish objective control on their own primary objective in their deployment zone. And that is, of course, because by turn 3 or turn 4, you probably would have at least tried to kill that unit on the back objective. So target units that are moving into those positions to prevent them from continuing to score on primary objectives. In turns 4 and 5, target units in position to score based on secondary objectives. So things like line breaker, behind enemy lines, or deploy teleporter homers. Make sure that if your opponent is in a position to score on those, that you try to prevent them if possible. And it's not always going to be possible, but I know for a fact that on deploy teleport homers, if your opponent doesn't quite have the movement because of the debuff to get into your deployment zone, they're going to be denied points, right? So if they draw that tactical secondary objective and they don't have anything that can realistically get in your deployment zone, except for maybe one unit, and it's a stretch, like they would have to get a 4 on an advance roll or something, that is the perfect unit to target with the Night Spinner. Because guess what? They're not going to be able to successfully score the max amount of points on that secondary objective, and you're denying them a lot of victory points by doing that. And in the later game, your opponent is going to be primarily focused on objectives, either primary objectives or secondary objectives, trying to max out their points as much as possible to bring home the win, right? At this point in the game, either they're doing really badly as far as the number of models they have left on the board. And same goes for you, right? You might not have a lot of models left either. You and your opponent might be at this point focusing more on objective play anyway, and the Night Spinner, which should be very well alive at this point in the game, should be able to exert more objective control than your opponent. So I know that some of these might be different, this turn-by-turn target priority. It might be different depending on the matchup and things like that. But in general, this is kind of what you want to use your Night Spinner for each turn you're shooting it. All right, so what is the Night Spinner's role in an Eldar army, and how do you make the most out of it? So the Night Spinner is essentially the ultimate control and disruption tool at our disposal, designed to prevent units from getting where they need to be to score victory points or threaten your units. If that wasn't enough, it can do so safely and reliably behind terrain. Not a lot of units can do that, only requiring a single hit to proc its ability. However, knowing enemy movement is key. If you don't know how fast an enemy can move, you might end up making the mistake of shooting at redundant units or shooting at the wrong things throughout the course of the game. Alright, so in conclusion, with the amount of board control a Night Spinner can provide, it's no wonder why it's taken in nearly every competitive list. However, knowing how fast your opponent's units can move in any given turn is key to knowing which units to target and the Night Spinner's overall success on the battlefield. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Sorry for the little bit of a delay. I was really busy yesterday and couldn't upload it, so I hope you'll forgive me for that. But thank you once again to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last months. Your help has greatly helped the channel improve and helped it grow considerably. If you do want to become a Patreon member, I have free trials activated, and a free trial will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love to talk about strategy, tactics, and of course hobbying. I'll leave the link for that in the description. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you want to grab some Eldar-inspired apparel or discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon, please look at the links in the description for those as well. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Peace out. See you guys next time, and have a good one. Have some good games this weekend, you guys. See you later.